to you and welcome to our special coverage of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. I'm Olumide Macaulay. The headlines. Russia launches first overnight drone attack on Kyiv in 12 days. Russia says it repelled Ukrainian attacks while Ukraine claims strikes on Russian personnel equipment. Plus, Spain's Prime Minister Pedro Sanchez addresses Ukrainian parliament, says Ukraine is going to win the war. Thank you so much for joining us. A Ukrainian military official has said Russia launched an overnight drone attack on Kyiv after a 12-day lull, with air defense systems preliminarily destroying all targets on their approach. Serhiy Popko, a colonel general who heads Kyiv's military administration, said in a post on Telegram, it partly reads, "Another enemy attack on Kyiv. At this moment, there is no information about possible casualties or damage." Witnesses heard blasts resembling the sound of air defense systems hitting targets. However, there was no immediate information about the scale of the attack. Kyiv, its region, and a number of central and eastern Ukraine regions were under air raid alerts for about an hour after 2 a.m. local time. Russia says its forces have repelled Ukrainian attacks on multiple fronts, while Ukraine claimed to have carried out strikes against military personnel and equipment concentration areas. Now, according to the Russian Defense Ministry, Russian forces succeeded in thwarting multiple attacks by the Ukrainian army in Donetsk, Krasny Liman, Zaporizhia, and other directions, resulting in the destruction of tanks, infantry fighting vehicles, self-propelled artillery, and various other Ukrainian equipment. In the Kherson direction, Russian forces blocked Ukrainian troops attempting to land near the Antonivka Road Bridge. The Russian Air Defense Forces also shot down a Ukrainian Su-25 fighter jet and intercepted Ukrainian UAVs and several rockets of the HIMARS system. Meanwhile, the General Staff of the Ukrainian Armed Forces, UAF, reported that numerous intense battles had taken place over the past 24 hours between Ukrainian and Russian forces in the directions of Krasny Liman, Bakhmut, Avdiivka, and Martinka. The Ukrainian Air Forces, missile units, and artillery units also launched strikes against Russian personnel and equipment concentration areas, artillery positions, air defense facilities, and other important targets. In the meantime, a Ukrainian air reconnaissance unit released drone footage showing a strike on a Russian tank near Bakhmut. The video captures a section of Ukraine's MO3 International Highway, which is approximately 13 kilometers, that's about 8 miles northwest of the center of Bakhmut, near the village of Oryovko-Vasilivka. The battle for the eastern Ukrainian city of Bakhmut has been the longest and bloodiest of the war so far. Western officials estimated between 20,000 and 30,000 Russian troops have been killed or wounded there. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky is warning that the enemy will not dictate the terms in the Black Sea. Speaking in his usual nightly address, Mr. Zelensky said, in his words, the invaders will have to be afraid or as afraid of approaching our Ukrainian Crimea and our Azov Sea coast as Russian ships are already afraid of approaching our Black Sea coast. Russia annexed the Crimean Peninsula on the Black Sea from Ukraine in 2014, but considers it to be outside the scope of its special military operation in eastern and southern Ukraine. Over the weekend, the Ukrainian president announced that a serious threat remained at the Russian-occupied Zaporizhia nuclear power plant and said Russia was technically ready to provoke a localized explosion at the facility. High above a railway bridge spanning a foaming river just outside the Arctic Circle, Finnish construction workers hammer away at a project that will smooth the connections from NATO's Atlantic coastline in Norway to its new border with Russia. This short stretch of rail is the only rail link between Sweden and Poland. Diplomats and military and security experts say that the alliance reshaped its strategy in response to Russia's campaign. Access to these new territories and their infrastructure opens ways for allies to watch and contain Moscow, an unprecedented chance to treat the whole of Northwest Europe as one bloc. Finland relies heavily on maritime freight for all its supplies. Customs data showed almost 96% of its foreign trade is carried across the Baltic Sea. However, if there was a conflict with Russia in the Baltic Sea area, where Russia has significant military capabilities at St. Petersburg and Kaliningrad, the shipping lane NATO used for that exercise will be vulnerable.
Basically, only major route for our supply is through the sea, and I think the Russians can quite easily interrupt the cargo transportation by the sea. So basically this northern route is the only accessible route after that.
We need electrification from the Kemi to the Haaparanta, and this is the missing part, the last mile of the electrification, what is needed now, and it is now under construction. And also some bridges has to be done more robust, that these new locomotives and also cargo can go across this bridge which goes over the border.
The Baltic Sea is as I said, it's a multi-domain area. It also can be easily described with what we call the 5 Cs: confined, confused, contested, congested, and cluttered. It's a very busy area. It's also confined in terms of the space, but it's also there's a lot of areas where we can hinder the opponent to move about on their own free will. So I would say that with 5 submarines, you can easily constrain the movements of your opponent.
For NATO, it's quite important to have now the whole northern part, to see it as a whole piece and not with the former NATO nations, Norway and Denmark. Now we have a whole bloc, and thinking about for potential defense plans, it's for us a huge step forward to consider it as a whole area now.
I can tell you as a military professional, the ability to move equipment and soldiers and ammunition and supplies in a rapid, organized way and efficient way is really important. It gives you lots of options into how you employ your forces. So any infrastructure that can enable the rapid movement of forces, whether it be ports, airfields, railways, highways, all this stuff is significant to warfare.
U.S. Central Intelligence Agency Director William Burns said that the armed mutiny by mercenary leader Yevgeny Prigozhin was a challenge to the Russian state that had shown the corrosive effect of President Vladimir Putin's war in Ukraine. Mr. Burns said the war had already been a strategic failure for Russia by showing up its military weakness and damaging the Russian economy for years to come, while the NATO military alliance was growing bigger and stronger.
Putin's war has already been a strategic failure for Russia. Its military weaknesses laid bare, its economy badly damaged for years to come, its future as a junior partner and economic colony of China being shaped by Putin's mistakes, its revanchist ambitions blunted by a NATO which has only grown bigger and stronger. This time last Saturday, we were all riveted by the scenes of Yevgeny Prigozhin's armed challenge to the Russian state, with Wagner paramilitary forces briefly seizing Rostov and moving 2/3 of the way to Moscow before turning back. As President Biden has made clear, this is an internal Russian affair in which the United States has had and will have no part. It is striking that Prigozhin preceded his actions with a scathing indictment of the Kremlin's mendacious rationale for the invasion of Ukraine, and of the Russian military leadership's conduct of the war. The impact of those words and those actions will play out for some time, a vivid reminder of the corrosive effect of Putin's war on his own society and his own regime. Russia's aggression poses a formidable test, but China is the only country with both the intent to reshape the international order and increasingly the economic, diplomatic, military, and technological power to do so. In today's world, no country wants to find itself at the mercy of a cartel of one for critical minerals and technologies, especially a country that has demonstrated the will and capacity to deepen and weaponize those dependencies. The answer to that is not to decouple from an economy like China's, which would be foolish, but to sensibly de-risk and diversify by securing resilient supply chains, protecting our technological edge, and investing in industrial capacity. Disaffection with the war will continue to gnaw away at the Russian leadership beneath the steady diet of state propaganda and practiced repression. That disaffection creates a once-in-a-generation opportunity for us at CIA, at our core, a human intelligence service. We're not letting it go to waste. The President sent me to Kabul in late August of 2021 to engage the Taliban leadership just prior to our final withdrawal.
Now let's talk to Mr. Peter Dickinson, publisher of Business Ukraine magazine Lviv Today, and also the editor at the Odessa Review, speaking to us from Kyiv in Ukraine. Welcome to the program this morning.
Good morning. It's a pleasure to join you.
Now, we just heard from the CIA director, Mr. Burns, William Burns, who says that it's a corrosive effect, Russia's war in Ukraine, showing their military weakness. Pedro Sanchez says that the war is going to be won by Ukraine, but 495 days is it now into this conflict? It's very worrying that people are still dying. Humanitarian disasters are still being threatened by the breakdown of the Kakhovka Dam and the flooding there, and this war continues. Could we start with your assessment of the road thus far? Russia seems to have advanced, according to Ukraine, on certain fronts, but Ukraine as well seems to be making some progress. What's your assessment?
Well, I think at this stage, of course, the focus is very much on Ukraine's counter-offensive, which has been anticipated for probably more than half a year. It's now been underway for approximately 1 month. And I think at this stage, the advances have been minimal. Perhaps it would be justified to call them disappointing. But on the other hand, expectations were possibly inflated. People were expecting faster than realistic advances, based largely on Ukraine's successes in the second half of 2022, when they liberated a significant portion in the northeast and in the south of the country. This offensive is a far larger operation. So Ukraine's forces are moving very slowly. Ukraine's commander-in-chief, Valery Zaluzhny, has spoken specifically on the lack of equipment Ukraine has. He's spoken in terms, quite critical terms, of the lack of air support Ukraine currently can offer its troops, and has noted, as many have noted, that no major Western power would attempt the military operations Ukraine is currently attempting to undertake without that air dominance that is taken as a basic tenet of modern warfare. Ukraine does not have that. Ukraine does not enjoy even localized air superiority, and yet is trying to advance against a country that is regarded still today as one of the world's leading military superpowers, despite the setbacks of the last year. So expectations perhaps were overly high. Nevertheless, Ukraine is advancing, but the advances are slow and localized. There's a lot of probing going on along the front. Ukraine is looking to draw Russia's defenses in, is looking to find weaknesses along a 1,000-kilometer front line. But there is no sign of any major breakthroughs yet. The counteroffensive will likely run for a number of months. and the war after it may run for much longer. So we are moving in a direction that Ukrainians are broadly probably satisfied with in a military sense, but there is no end in sight.
Military experts and analysts with insights into this war agree with you. They concur where you mentioned the need for superiority in the skies for Ukraine to make visible progress in this war. Just yesterday or the other, I believe President Zelensky was complaining that as far as the training of the F-16 fighter pilots and the delivery of those jets, nothing had been done for that to happen. But this is after much ado about the F-16s and the F-16s and the F-16s. But it seems that the nations that are promising the F-16s have not given President Zelensky something tangible for him to go on.
Yes, there is frustration regarding the F-16 specifically, and I think more broadly the speed and level of military support. If we take a broad view, the military support for Ukraine has grown remarkably over the past 16 months of the invasion. We've gone from Ukraine receiving very minimal amounts of handheld anti-tank and anti-aircraft weapons, essentially partisan guerrilla warfare weapons, to now receiving modern tanks, the most sophisticated air defense systems, long-range missiles, and other very sophisticated weapons. So we're clearly moving in a trend towards far larger quantities of weapons deliveries and far more sophisticated weapons systems. Nevertheless, the process is slow, and at every single stage, the decision to deliver to Ukraine is preceded by a very long and drawn-out political debate in which countries express concern and express hesitancy and talk about not provoking Russia. And this is a very draining fact. Ukrainians find this deeply frustrating. They are very angry, I would say, about this. And they often note that every single day of delay is paid for in Ukrainian blood. Ukrainians die. This is not a political debate. This is a life and death debate. And the Ukrainian position is very clear. They are basically saying to their partners, of course, thank you, but we need it now. We need weapons to win the war. We believe you will give these weapons because it's in your interest to do so. Please get on with it. Please, let's end this hesitancy. Let's end these delays. Let's move forward. The sooner you give these weapons, the sooner we can end this war, end this horror, and move towards establishing a sustainable peace in Europe.
Russia is obviously looking at that and is playing into their hands, as slow as that delivery of these weapons for the Ukrainians may be for the F-16s. But now let's look at the mediation efforts and the peace efforts from the Vatican. Cardinal Matteo Zuppi has been in Moscow. He's earlier been in Kyiv, I believe. And now he says that the Vatican is primarily now there for humanitarian concerns and not for mediation. And he's speaking to the press or to the public, said that the Vatican was concerned about the humanitarian aspects of the war as far as how it affects civilians and loss of life and the safety of the children as well in particular. Historically, the Vatican had a bad rap for the controversial position of Pope Pius XII concerning the non-denunciation of Nazi Germany at that time. But now, is it important at all for the Vatican to condemn or to speak out against this war in Ukraine, to take sides?
Well, the Vatican has been very careful not to take sides, I would say. They've been perhaps overly cautious. Certainly there's been a lot of criticism in Ukraine over the positions adopted by the Vatican. There have been a number of specific comments from Pope Francis which have seemed to draw some sort of parallels between Russia and Ukraine, as if they were somehow equally culpable or equally responsible for the war and for peace. There were on a number of occasions the Vatican has staged public events in which they've brought together Russian and Ukrainians. It's some sort of a peace gesture, which of course is a welcome gesture in many senses. But the idea of equating Russian and Ukrainians together and suggesting that all they need to do is make peace is very alarming for Ukrainians, of course, because they see this as a war of aggression, a war of annihilation waged against them by Russia. They don't see it as an equal discussion on which both sides simply need to make peace. They see Russia is the aggressor. Russia must be held accountable for this. So that has been a very alarming trend from the Vatican to try and draw some sort of a equivalency between Ukrainian and Russian responsibility for the war, involvement in the war. Having said all that, of course, efforts to promote peace by the international community, efforts by such major players, such significant participants as the papacy, as the Vatican, are welcome generally. This needs to happen, and it does draw attention to the war. It keeps the war in the international spotlight, which is a very high priority for Ukraine. Ukrainians are very alarmed and afraid that there will become a normalization of Russia's invasion, that people will simply become acclimatized to the horrors that we see on a daily basis here in Ukraine. So it's welcome in that sense, but there are very few illusions that the Vatican will play a key role in any peace process.
Mr. Dickinson, Wagner Group is infamous around the world, but famous in Central African Republic, CAR, and other areas where they helped to put down rebellions from rebel leaders where these countries had issues. Now, in the wake of their dispersal to Belarus, and keeping in mind that there's been a shroud of uncertainty as to whether or not Wagner will be able to continue its operations in continents like Africa, where it has succeeded, such as in the CAR, when in 2018 they put down rebel forces, and they are celebrated like heroes, like Robin Hood in CAR. Because of that, Russia is taught in some of their schools. Because of that, they're almost venerated in CAR. But that, keeping in mind what they're doing with Ukraine, is Wagner as a mercenary group, is their existence in any way threatened by this war? And how much of a role will they begin to play? And also, sorry, could you also chip in concerning their position in Belarus that has Poland concerned?
Well, the future of the Wagner Group now is very much shrouded in mystery and uncertainty. It looks very unlikely that they will continue to play a leading role in the Russian invasion of Ukraine. They had played a leading role there. In fact, Wagner had been responsible for almost all of Russia's very minimal advances over the past year. They represented perhaps 10% of Russia's invasion force, perhaps slightly more, but they've been responsible for almost 100% of Russia's advances, particularly in the city of Bakhmut. So the loss of the Wagner Group to Russia's military, to the invasion, is very significant, because it really makes their force even more toothless than it was and limits their ability to advance. Now, beyond Ukraine, what next for Wagner? That's the great question. It's anticipated that they will remain a key force in Africa. They will continue to be the Kremlin's key foreign policy tool in Africa. They will now be probably a much smaller organization, a much more specialized organization. The basing of them in Belarus is interesting. Of course, some have suggested this may be a prelude to a new northern offensive from Belarus on Kyiv and northern Ukraine. At the beginning of the war, Belarus was used as a platform for the march on Kyiv that ultimately led to defeat for Russia in February, March of 2022. There seem to be smaller numbers for that to be a realistic opportunity at the moment, but the Wagner troops may be used to cause mischief on Belarus's western border with Poland and the EU, with NATO countries. So it's a very uncertain picture, but there's a lot of scope for mischief, a lot of scope for problems that the Wagner Group can cause to Ukraine, and possibly also to Belarus's western neighbors who are EU and NATO members. But one thing we can say with some certainty is the days where Wagner was a major force in the invasion of Ukraine are likely now over.
Amongst the Committee of Nations, Russia is the bad guy, to put it in movie parlance, because of this war in Ukraine. Largely unpopular, and many companies have cut ties. Some of them have pulled out of Russia. Some of them are not doing business with Russia as they have been previously. In the case of oil companies such as Shell and Total, they're being accused of still doing business with Russia, despite the fact that they themselves, in their arguments, say that they're not doing business with Russia, but they are held to binding contracts. There was a study or an allegation or a disclosure, if you like, that Russia made $21 billion because of their business in liquefied natural gas supply from Russia, LNG, facilitated by Total or Shell. So are these companies hands tied? They can't. They've signed on the dotted line, so they're in a binding contract. What can they do?
Well, that's really a question for the lawyers, I would say. I mean, I think we've seen that, I think historically there's been a lot of precedents where countries have been able to escape from legal obligations due to force majeure or major international developments. I think that there's certainly an opinion that I've seen, and perhaps would go so far as to share, that if they really wanted to, they could get out of these obligations. There are legal tools available to do so. I think really we're talking here about the need for greater international pressure to force these countries to do so. The cooperation with Russia has always carried with it reputational risk and the risk of involvement with a regime that is responsible or is accused of widespread war crimes, even going back to long before the invasion of Ukraine. That's nothing new. However, Russia has also always offered the opportunities of very attractive profits for these major international energy companies in particular. So it's always been a matter of compromising between profit margins and reputational standards and involvement with Russia, never more so than today. What we need to do as an international community, and certainly what Ukraine would like to see happen, would be for the reputational costs to be much higher in terms of the sanctions that will be imposed and in terms of the damage done to the brands, that other companies would see them as toxic and would not wish to be connected with them for their involvement in Russia. The legal argument, I feel, is widely viewed as an excuse, as a way of saying, look, our hands are tied. Well, a lot of companies have managed to extricate themselves from Russia despite having also significant obligations. Many companies have accepted significant losses in order to remove themselves from Russia because they have assessed that the costs of staying in Russia are higher than the costs of perhaps engaging in breaking contracts, in doing things that are legally leave them open to some response. But they've drawn the conclusion that it's actually more costly for them in a reputational sense to remain as partners of a Russian regime like the regime of Vladimir Putin. So clearly it's a cost analysis issue, and the pressure is very much on the international community to make sure those costs are high enough so that companies that are still doing business with Russia say, you know what, regardless of what we've signed or committed to, we're going to get out.
Well, always a pleasure, Mr. Dickinson. We ran out of time for this segment, but I was going to ask that, is it fair for companies who are in a binding contract before the Ukrainian invasion, before the special military operation, according to Russia, to be held accountable for what they know nothing about, and they have contracts, they have families, they need to be fed, they have this whole infrastructure, this whole thing going before this invasion and this military conflict, that they have to pay for it with their profits?
Well, that is the payoff. Yes, it's not cheap. There are no good answers. There are no easy solutions, frankly. There are people who are paying a lot more than the profit margins of international energy companies at this point. I think that is also very important to point out. So nobody says that it's painless. I think it clearly would be painful for a lot of companies. It has been painful for a lot of companies. and that will remain the case. But you do have to be held accountable for involvement. Now, yes, Russia was not seen in the same light 2 years ago as it is today, but it was already pretty clear that it was a very dangerous rogue regime that was involved in all sorts of acts of international aggression. It was, in my opinion, unwise to intensify cooperation with Russia for many of these companies, given what we knew already of Russia then. And I think now it should be an absolute priority for any international company which takes its corporate branding and its corporate responsibility seriously to extricate itself and distance itself as much as possible from Russia, even if that involves significant costs, because the costs of not doing so are and must be significantly higher.
Always a pleasure, Mr. Peter Dickinson. Thank you for coming on the program this morning. The publisher of Business Ukraine magazine, Lviv Today, also the editor at the Odessa Review. Many thanks.
Thank you.
After the break, Wagner says it'll suspend recruitment for a month in wake of armed rebellion. Please stay with us. Welcome to the sophomore stretch of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, as covered by us. Spain's Prime Minister Pedro Sanchez addressed Ukrainian parliament over the weekend, saying Ukraine is going to win the war and reiterating the European commitment to Ukrainian future EU membership. Sanchez also announced that Spain will send another 55 million euros in aid to Ukraine. As Spain takes over the European Union's 6-month rotating presidency, the Prime Minister reiterated that the war in Ukraine had its consequences will be a priority during the presidency.
Excellencies, last February, before my trip to Kyiv, someone in Madrid, in my city, was wondering about the Ukrainian state of mind and asked me, "Do you think they are afraid?" When I came back after the visit, I had a clear answer to this question, and I told them, look, they are not afraid. They are going to win. It will take them weeks, months. It will take tears, blood and sweat, but Ukraine is going to win this war. We do not forget that the European aspiration of the Ukrainian people was one of the excuses that triggered the Russian reaction and, in turn, the invasion. It was only fair to honor this aspiration by granting you the status of candidate to the European Union. No one deserved it more than you, than Ukraine. However, I know that this is not an easy process, especially with an ongoing war. To become a member state requires change, reforms, and sacrifices. Not long ago, Spain faced this challenge as a candidate country. But let me tell you that the process to become an European Union member taught us important lessons. One of them is that undertaking reforms has a value in itself. Reforms make your governance and your economy better, more modern, more transparent. They bolster international confidence and proximity. They attract investment, and in time, they will grant you access to our European Union. Ukraine is paying a heavy price in terms of destructions of cities and infrastructure. So we need to make sure that the country is rebuilt, thus creating the conditions for its growth and prosperity. And we have already started.
Prime Minister of Spain, Pedro Sanchez. Now we're pleased to speak with Major General Pat Akem Finger, military strategist, former commander 4 and 9 Mechanized Brigade, former commander Special Task Force in Plateau, Provost Marshal in the Army. It's good to have you with us this morning.
Thank you, Ayo. Thank you very much.
Olumide.
Oh, it's Olumide. Okay, sorry.
No problem.
Okay, Olumide, sorry.
No problem. You're welcome to the program again. Are you as optimistic as the Spanish Prime Minister Pedro Sanchez, who just said, and is he going out on a limb? He's saying it, Ukraine is going to win the war. We know that just yesterday, Ukraine themselves have admitted that Russia is making advances. There seems to be a rekindling of their efforts to push back the Ukrainian counteroffensive. Could we begin by asking you, and you telling us what your overview is of the state of the conflict in Ukraine?
Okay, thank you. Let me start by answering the first question you posed. I think that me and the Prime Minister are wearing two different sets of lenses. I'm looking at this thing from a military perspective, and maybe he has a different picture. From a military perspective, this thing is going to continue to be a slog, some kind of slugfest that will be bloody. You will recall that we had said here before that there was going to be a counteroffensive, and in my last appearance, I said it was going to be delayed and it was going to suffer some kind of setback. And we are seeing it as the probing attacks have been ongoing. The weaknesses of the Ukrainian forces have become manifest. And this is understandable because you can't really fight a modern war of this nature without some kind of air parity or superiority. And Ukraine is completely devoid of that kind of assets and assistance. The planes have not been given, and as a result of that, they are operating in open terrain. That they are open to attacks, they are open to some casualties that would have been avoided if they had air cover. Okay, having said that, let me go back and maybe recapture the general picture.
Yeah.
Russia started this operation with some set of objectives, and apparently they've not been met. Unwittingly, a stress test of the military has been conducted without... the results are obvious for us to see that logistic tangles, rigid hierarchical structures, communication issues, command and control. Because of that rigid setup, what the West does in war has not been applicable. Where you give commanders room to operate what we call mission command, where they take fleeting opportunities, where they exercise initiative, those have been missing. As a result of that, Russia has suffered. The way we view Russia has slightly changed. That is not to say that it is not a strong fighting force. As a matter of fact, they are fighting better now. So yes, I will not support the view that this war will suddenly end and Ukraine will be victorious. Russia is a superpower in terms of military forces. They will continue to fight, and Ukraine will continue to fight. But you see, the difference between them is that Ukraine is completely reliant on Western support, and changes of government, changes of ideologies may impact what is going on now. So basically, that is my take.
Major General, give us an idea of what happens on the battlefield. It's very visceral for those that are in combat as professional soldiers. In the counteroffensive, we understand from reports that the Russians have dug themselves in. They had ample time to prepare for this Ukrainian counteroffensive, and that there are reports that there's a lot of trench warfare going on, that the Russians have dug themselves in. They possibly placed mines in the way of the Ukrainians advancing. As you've mentioned, they're in open terrain in this terrestrial combat. Give us an idea of how difficult it will be for these Ukrainian soldiers, many of whom are conscripts, and even the Russian soldiers who are also conscripted to a large degree, but possibly not as much as the Ukrainians, what they will be going through for this counteroffensive to be successful for either side.
Okay, I think there was an overestimation of what the Ukrainians were going to do based on their performance towards the second half of last year. There were a series of victories and recapturing of territory, so it was assumed that they were going to do very well with this counter-offensive, and in fact, they telegraphed that there was going to be a counter-offensive. I think that was a strategic failure. They shouldn't have done that. You want to attack the enemy, and you are telegraphing and telling the enemy, we are going to do a counter-offensive, we are going to overrun your locations, we are going to attack you. So Russia had enough able room to prepare, and they have. Deep trenches, mines, layers and layers of mines, prepared killing fields. So it's been very difficult going forward for the Ukrainians. They are navigating through minefields without air cover. They are navigating through places that have been prepared and in place with weapons that will just render munitions on them. So it's challenging, and that is why they are making very incremental advances. 500 meters in a day, on good days, 1,000 meters. It's going to be challenging. They've been crying for some kind of air cover, and I think that is an imperative. If you really want to give them a shot at even bringing Russia to the point where there are negotiations, you have to give them more access than what they have received so far. The Western world has been very reluctant. They've been thinking that there are some red lines to be crossed. If I were advising Washington, I would say that it's either you are in or you are out. You can't keep on saying there are some red lines to be crossed. But again, Russia is in a better position now. They are fighting better. They are defending, and when you are defending with the kind of advantages they have, you can inflict a lot of casualties on your enemy, and that is happening. And Ukraine has been very cautious. Like President Zelensky said yesterday, that they do not just throw men into war, that they are cautious, that they know they are human beings. Otherwise, it will be like throwing people into a meat grinder. They will kill them on a scale that will be shocking. So they are being very, very cautious in their approach. Where like I said, the probing attacks that are supposed to shape what is going to come have exposed some vulnerabilities, and we are seeing them on display.
You spoke of possible command structure rigidity in the Russian military hierarchy. Sergei Shoigu is the man in charge, but Surovikin, another main commander in the Russian army, has been out of the public eye. It's been alleged that they don't have information as to his location at the moment, and questions from the press were met with responses that they should refer those questions to the defense ministry, allegations that he had something to do with Yevgeny Prigozhin and his march on Moscow. Could you tell us what your overall impression of that situation is? And also, could you also tell us whether you're of the view, as a former commander also on this program said, that as far as that dispersal to Belarus goes, that it might be a deception and it may not be a dispersal, but a deployment in disguise to Belarus so they can attack Kyiv because of the proximity of Kyiv to Belarus?
That is a theory that is difficult to prove. What that guy did was an embarrassment to Putin. Putin wouldn't want to be embarrassed like that just to create a ruse. I don't think that is true. I do not believe that. I think that the last guess was spot on. As far as this war is concerned, Wagner is finished. They will no longer be participating in it. That thing was humiliating. It was embarrassing. And you will remember that they actually shot at and brought down some Russian helicopters and a plane. You don't pay that kind of price just to create a ruse. Nobody does that in war. That you would disgrace yourself, create an impression that there are conflicts and fixtures within your regime, your governance structures, just to create a ruse. No. You can do maneuvers. You do that through maneuvers. You do that through tactical maneuvers. You do that through strategic moves. You don't do that by by firing at your own troops. Killings. About 13 people died, and some of them were pilots. So you can't say that to the world that, oh, it was just a ruse. No. I think that the Wagner Group, their role in this war is just generally over, unless the leadership is changed and they are integrated into the Russian mainstream armed forces. I think that is my take.
And your impression of how the Russian commanders are prosecuting this war?
Well, like I said, initially they were challenges. They are fighting better now. But when you entrench a culture within the military, a fighting mode or culture, it's normally difficult to change quickly and adapt. And that is why trainings keep going, or become ongoing, are always ongoing. The Russian system is to depend on very strict hierarchical command structures. And as a result of that, they are unable to react the way we would have reacted. They wait for orders, and waiting for orders like that, opportunities, fleeting opportunities that would have been taken are lost. So I think it will be difficult to change that structure quickly like that. They are used to it, but like I said, they are doing better now. When you've had enough room to prepare defenses the way they have, all you need to do is to wait and hit the enemy when he comes. And that is what they are doing. And again, they are operating in the air freely, so to speak. And then again, you know, they are employing a variant of what the US did in Iraq, their own shock and awe. That is why you've been seeing those attacks on targets that otherwise wouldn't be hit in normal wars. I think basically that is it.
So the liberty you're speaking of that possibly the Russian soldiers don't have because they follow orders strictly, is that possibly why Wagner was more successful, because they had more liberty to take decisions in the theater of battle?
Yes, and again, you know, the guy Wagner didn't, apart from the point you've made, he didn't quite care about the number. He was casual about casualties. It didn't matter. You know, he threw so many troops at Bakhmut, and we were wondering what was the strategic objective of that city, that you lose close to 10,000, 20,000 troops. Normal armies do not do that. So, you know, if you are a mercenary, you can do that. You are hiring people. They understand that they can die, and so he didn't care really, and that was what happened.
For the bigger picture going forward, NATO is consolidating its position, and it's been spoken, it's been said that NATO has never felt more alive than it is right now, and this has been precipitated by the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Do you think militaries' budgets, defense budgets around the world that are being jacked up, especially in Europe, that this is a sign of things to come?
In the near future, yes. I think this war was a whole miscalculation. But again, maybe President Putin knew some things that we didn't know. But I think it was a whole miscalculation. The objective of trying to put away NATO, to destabilize NATO, to separate them, to divide them, has failed. On the contrary, an unexpected outcome has become very manifest. We are seeing that nations are building up. Finland has joined NATO. Others are on queue to join. So from that perspective, that was a failure. That was a miscalculation. That was a strategic miscalculation, and it will continue to play out. Nations are building up, especially in Europe. And like I said here earlier on one of my appearances, I said that Europe wasn't expecting to have a war at the heart of Europe in the 21st century, and this has become a shock. So those who were not prepared before are preparing that, look, this thing it can be us tomorrow. We can't say their fears are unfounded because Putin has been unpredictable. So basically that is my take.
Thank you for your insights and making the time out to be with us on the program. Major General Pat Akemvinga, former commander of 4 and 9 Mechanized Brigades.
Thank you, Olumide. Thank you so much.
When we return, alive and kicking for now, but isolated Russian football risks going backwards. That's in a moment. Please stay with us. Welcome to the final stretch of today's coverage of Russian invasion of Ukraine. Yevgeny Prigozhin's private military company, the Wagner Group, is suspending its recruitment efforts for 1 month as it moves operations to Belarus. A Telegram channel affiliated with Prigozhin said, due to the temporary non-participation of Wagner PMC in a special military operation and moving to the Republic of Belarus, we are temporarily suspending the work of regional recruitment centers for PMC Wagner for a period of 1 month. Belarusian President Alexander Lukashenko reportedly brokered a deal for Prigozhin and his forces to exit Russia after Wagner's stunning short-lived rebellion against the Kremlin last week. Up to that point, Wagner had played a key role in Russia's war in Ukraine, especially in the embattled eastern town of Bakhmut, with insurrection and Prigozhin's apparent severing of long-held alliance with Russian President Vladimir Putin. Questions swirl about the future of the mercenary chief and other Russian officials with ties to his group. Now, last week, Lukashenko invited Wagner mercenaries to train his military during a speech dedicated to Belarus Independence Day. In previous speeches, Lukashenko said Wagner had been offered some abandoned land inside Belarus as needed. Meanwhile, the Wagner Group signs and all Wagner insignia have been removed from the Wagner Center business block in St. Petersburg. The building was opened in November 2022 and was seen as a major step by Wagner Group founder Evgeny Prigozhin to publicize his military credentials and take a more public role in shaping Russia's defense policy. The building was raided by the police on June the 24th amidst the mutiny. The fate of Prigozhin, who rose to become Russia's most powerful mercenary, remains unclear. A private jet linked to him flew from St. Petersburg, the former imperial capital of Russia, to Moscow last Saturday, though it was unclear who was on board the aircraft. The Kremlin spokesperson Dmitry Peskov said that he did not have information about Prigozhin's current location. Energy giant Total Energies and Shell have defended activities linked to Russia after a critical report into their trading in natural gas LNG despite the war in Ukraine. The campaign group Global Witness said Total Energies was the third biggest player in Russian LNG last year and Shell the fourth behind the Russian companies. The report focused on UK's Shell after Global Witness said it had previously looked at Total Energies of France. According to the report, Russia's LNG exports are helping to finance the country's war in Ukraine, and in 2022 were worth an estimated $21 billion. Both companies said they were tied to ongoing contracts despite pulling out of Russian partnerships after Moscow's full-scale invasion of Ukraine last year. Finally, on the program, Russia's reigning Premier League champions Zenit St. Petersburg wrapped up the defense of their title last month, winning their last home game against rival Spartak Moscow 3-2. Zenit are the dominant footballing power in Russia's top league right now, and its wealthiest club, supported by the country's energy giant Gazprom. And while Zenit players, coach Sergei Simak, and club fans celebrate another successful season and another league title, there is no path for the Russian champions to play in Europe's top club competitions next season. The season's domestic success only highlights the fact that European football has turned its back on the Russian game. UEFA and World Football governing body FIFA decided that all Russian teams, national or domestic, will be suspended from participation in their competitions after Moscow sent tens of thousands of troops into Ukraine. UEFA chief Alexander Seferin said in April this year it'll be very hard to lift Russia's suspension until the war ends. There have been some contact between UEFA and Russia's football union about lifting the ban imposed after the invasion of Ukraine, but the negotiations have reportedly been tough. For Zenit and Russia's other big clubs, returning to the riches of UEFA Champions League and the Europa League are a priority, and the Russian national team is isolated too, barred from international competition and limited to playing friendly matches against national sides in Asian Football Confederation, with games last March against Iran and Iraq. And that's where we leave it for today's coverage of Russian invasion of Ukraine. Thank you for watching. I'm Olumide Macaulay. See you.